Mom. My heart stopped. I had barely stepped inside the house when I heard my son's voice. His small, innocent voice saying a word that should only ever belong to me. But he wasn't talking to me. Noah, my 5-year-old, was standing in the living room looking up at her. She stood there in my home, her auburn hair curled perfectly over her shoulders, her manicured nails resting lightly on my son's shoulder, like she had the right. Like she belonged here. And then he spoke. She's your new mom now, Noah. Daniel's voice was smooth, unwavering, cold. I turned toward him, my hands trembling at my sides. He stood with his arms crossed, wearing a crisp navy suit, completely unbothered. As if he hadn't just ripped the ground from beneath my feet. Noah looked confused. His bright green eyes, my eyes, darted between me and Sophia. But, she's not my mommy, he whispered. My breath hitched. Sophia's lips curved into a smirk. She knelt beside him, her hazel eyes filled with the kind of arrogance only a woman who had already won could wear. I know this is new, sweetheart, she cooed, brushing a hand over his blonde curls. But you'll get used to it. Your dad and I, she glanced at Daniel with something possessive in her gaze, just want what's best for you. I snapped. I stormed forward, grabbing Noah's small hand and pulling him to me. My voice shook. Don't touch my son. Sophia raised a delicate brow, then laughed. Laughed. Like this was funny. Like I wasn't standing here breaking. Daniel sighed, shaking his head. Emma, don't be dramatic. Dramatic. My voice came out sharp, a blade cutting through the heavy silence. You tell our son to call another woman mom, and I'm being dramatic? Noah clung to my waist, his little fingers digging into the fabric of my coat. I could feel his heart pounding against mine, his tiny body trembling. But Daniel wasn't done. He stepped closer, his piercing blue eyes cold, emotionless. You're just his mother by birth. That's all. Something inside me shattered. It wasn't just the words. It was the finality in them. The casual way he dismissed me. The woman who carried his child, who stayed up at night rocking him to sleep, who kissed every scraped knee, who loved him more than anything in this world. I searched his face for any sign of regret. Any hesitation. There was none. I had never meant less to him than I did in this moment. Noah sniffled against my chest. Mommy. His small voice was barely a whisper, but it was enough to pull me back. Enough to make me realize one thing. I couldn't do this. I couldn't fight a man who didn't care. I couldn't stay in a home where I was replaceable. So I did the only thing I could. I lifted my chin, forced my trembling hands to still, and looked Daniel in the eye. You win. His brow furrowed slightly, the first sign of confusion flashing across his face. What? I released a slow breath, then gently knelt in front of Noah, cupping his small face in my hands. His big teary green eyes met mine. I kissed his forehead, smoothing back his curls. I love you, I whispered. His bottom lip trembled. Mommy, don't go. My throat tightened. My vision blurred. But I didn't break. I wouldn't break. I stood, turning to Daniel. His confusion was gone, replaced by something unreadable. Maybe he thought I would fight. Maybe he thought I would beg. I wouldn't give him the satisfaction. I took off my wedding ring, the symbol of a life that had died long before today, and set it on the marble table beside me. Then without another word I walked away. And Daniel? He let me. I should have kept walking. I should have grabbed my keys, walked out that door, and never looked back. But I couldn't. Not when Noah's small, shaky voice echoed behind me. Mommy. I turned. He was crying. My little boy, my heart, stood in the middle of the living room, his green eyes wide with confusion, fear. His small hands were clenched into fists, his tiny shoulders shaking as he looked between me and Daniel. The betrayal, the shock, it was too much. I dropped to my knees, reaching for him, but Daniel stepped between us. My breath caught. Noah, I whispered, trying to step around him, but Daniel blocked me. My head snapped up. His blue eyes were colder than I had ever seen them. You're making this harder than it needs to be, he said, his tone detached. I barely heard him. My focus was on Noah, who was trying to push past his father, his little face red and damp with tears. I want Mommy. Daniel's jaw tightened. He reached down, gripping Noah's shoulders, forcing him still. She's leaving, Noah, he said firmly. And you need to accept that. A sharp pain ripped through my chest. No. Noah screamed. He tried to fight against Daniel's grip, his small hands pushing against his arms. I don't want her to go. Mommy, don't go. I moved without thinking. Let him go, Daniel. He didn't. Instead, his grip on our son tightened, his fingers pressing into Noah's small shoulders, keeping him in place. Sophia, still seated on the couch, let out a soft sigh. You're only confusing him, Emma. My head snapped toward her, rage boiling in my veins. You don't speak about my son, I hissed. She smirked. Daniel sighed, rubbing his temple. Emma, just stop. Stop. My voice was shaking now, with anger, with disbelief. You tell our son to call another woman Mom. You rip me away from him like I'm nothing and I'm the problem? Daniel's gaze hardened. I told you this is better for him. No, my hands balled into fists. This is better for you. A flicker of irritation crossed his face. You're making a scene. I laughed. A sharp, broken sound. A scene? You took my son from me, Daniel. His shoulders stiffened, his mask of calm cracking just slightly. He's not going anywhere. He's staying here in his home where he belongs. My stomach turned to ice. It hit me then. He never planned on letting me take Noah. This wasn't just cruelty. This was calculated. A chill ran down my spine as I stared at the man I had once loved, the man I had married. You planned this, I whispered. Didn't you? Daniel's lips pressed together. He didn't deny it. Because of course he did. His money. His influence. His power. He knew that if I left I would have nothing. No house. No savings. Everything was in his name. And no custody. Because no judge would ever rule against Daniel Carter, the perfect businessman, the respectable father. He had set the pieces in place long before today. I looked at my son, still crying, still reaching for me, and I realized I had already lost. I took a slow breath, forcing my voice to steady. I will fight for him. Daniel smirked, like he had been waiting for me to say it. And you'll lose, he said smoothly. The words cut deep. Not because they were cruel, but because they were true. He had the money, the connections. He could turn me into the villain overnight. A bad mother, an unfit parent, an unstable woman. And I had nothing. I had never felt more powerless in my life. Noah sobbed harder. Mommy, please. Tears blurred my vision. I couldn't take him. Not now. Not yet. But I could do one thing. I could leave. So I took a slow, shaking breath. And then I did the hardest thing I had ever done. I forced a smile, kneeling so I could meet Noah's teary gaze. I brushed my fingers through his curls, memorizing him. Mommy loves you, I whispered. He clung to me. Please don't go. I kissed his forehead, closing my eyes for a moment. Then I stood. Daniel didn't stop me this time. Because he had already won. But this wasn't over. I looked at him one last time, my heart breaking, my hands shaking. You'll regret this, I whispered. And then, without another word, I walked away. And my son's cries followed me out the door. The night air was cold against my skin, but I barely felt it. My hands trembled as I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles white, my breathing uneven. I had driven aimlessly for the past hour, my mind racing, my heart stuck in my throat. Noah's cries still echoed in my ears. I had left him. The words cut deeper than anything Daniel had said. I had walked out, leaving my son behind with a man who had already erased me from his life. But I hadn't had a choice. I pulled into an empty parking lot, my vision blurred with unshed tears. The weight of reality settled over me like an unbearable force. Daniel had won this battle. He had played his game perfectly, stripping me of everything. My home, my security, even my son. But I wasn't done. I wiped at my face, taking a shaky breath. I couldn't fall apart. Not now. Not when Noah was still trapped in that house. I needed a plan. My phone buzzed on the passenger seat. For a brief moment my heart leapt. I grabbed it quickly, praying it was Noah, somehow reaching out to me. But when I looked at the screen my stomach dropped. Daniel. I hesitated, my thumb hovering over the screen. A part of me didn't want to answer. I didn't want to hear his voice, didn't want to hear whatever cruel, calculated words he had prepared for me. But another part of me, the mother in me, needed to know if Noah was okay. I took a deep breath and pressed the call button. Daniel's voice came through smooth, unbothered. That was easier than I expected. My grip on the phone tightened. You're a monster. He chuckled, the sound slow and infuriating. I'm a man who knows how to win, Emma. You walked right into my plan. I clenched my jaw, my body shaking. Is Noah okay? Daniel sighed as if I was nothing more than an inconvenience. He's fine. Sophia is taking care of him now. A sharp pain shot through my chest. My son was with her. Breathing became difficult, my vision blurring again. I pressed my forehead against the steering wheel, trying to steady myself. You won't get away with this, I whispered. Daniel hummed thoughtfully. And what exactly do you plan to do? You have no money, no home, no legal leverage. If you fight for custody, I'll drag you through court until you have nothing left. And in the meantime... He paused, letting the silence settle in. Noah will be calling someone else Mom. I squeezed my eyes shut. I couldn't do this. I couldn't listen to another word. I ended the call. The moment the line went dead, a sob tore through my throat. I gripped the steering wheel like it was the only thing keeping me from falling apart. I had never felt so helpless. But I wouldn't stay that way. I sat up straighter, wiping the tears from my face. I had one thing left, time. Daniel thought he had one, but he didn't understand one thing about me. I had lost everything. Which meant I had nothing left to lose. And that made me dangerous. I wasn't giving up. I was going to fight. And I was going to take back what was mine. The house was quieter than it had ever been. Noah sat at the dining table, his small hands gripping a spoon, his dinner untouched. The plate in front of him was filled with the kind of food he usually loved, but tonight he didn't take a single bite. Sophia sat across from him, her perfect manicured nails tapping lightly against the table, frustration evident in her posture. She had expected him to adjust, to accept her presence the way Daniel had forced it upon him. But Noah didn't. He barely looked at her. He barely spoke at all. Daniel sighed from the head of the table, glancing at his son. Noah, eat. No response. Noah's green eyes, Emma's eyes, remained fixed on the plate, his tiny fingers tightening around his spoon. Sophia sighed, offering a forced smile. Sweetheart, I made this just for you. Still nothing. Daniel set down his fork, rubbing his temple in irritation. Noah. His voice was firmer now, sharper. Noah flinched slightly but didn't lift his gaze. I want Mommy. His voice was barely a whisper, but in the silence of the room it was deafening. Daniel's jaw tightened. Sophia's lips pressed together. Noah, Daniel said again, slower this time. Your mother. He hesitated, carefully choosing his words. She made her decision. She's not coming back. Noah's little hands curled into fists. Sophia reached out to touch him, to comfort him, but the moment her fingers brushed against his arm, he jerked away. You're not my mom, he shouted, his voice shaking. Sophia gasped, pulling back as if he had slapped her. Daniel's grip on his glass tightened, his blue eyes darkening with frustration. Noah, he snapped, but the boy was already pushing away from the table, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. He ran. Daniel stood, ready to follow, but Sophia placed a hand on his arm, stopping him. Let him be, she murmured, her tone softer now, more calculated. He just needs time. Daniel exhaled sharply, running a hand through his dark hair. His son had never defied him before. Never looked at him with resentment. And yet, tonight for the first time, Noah had. The thought unsettled him. The next morning, Daniel expected things to improve. He expected Noah to wake up, to accept that Emma was gone, to fall into the rhythm of this new life. But he didn't. Noah stopped speaking. He barely ate. At night he cried himself to sleep, muffling his sobs with his pillow. And every time Daniel tried to comfort him, tried to tell him that everything was fine, he flinched. Daniel didn't understand it. He had given Noah everything. A beautiful house, a comfortable life. But the one thing Noah wanted was gone. And for the first time, Daniel felt something foreign settle in his chest. It wasn't regret. Not yet. But it was something close. Because no matter how much he told himself otherwise, no matter how much he pretended he had done the right thing, he couldn't deny the truth that sat right in front of him. Noah missed his mother. And deep down Daniel knew, nothing he did would ever change that. Days passed. Then weeks. The house remained as grand as ever, but something inside it had changed. Noah stopped laughing. He stopped running down the halls with his toy cars, stopped asking for bedtime stories, stopped leaving his little drawings on the fridge. His green eyes, once so full of light, were now dull, empty. He barely spoke. When Daniel tried to talk to him, Noah answered in short, quiet words, his voice barely above a whisper. When Sophia tried to engage him, he simply turned away, refusing to meet her gaze. It infuriated her. She had stepped into this house believing she had won. She was Daniel's wife in everything but name. She lived in Emma's home, slept in Emma's bed, and yet Noah refused to see her as anything but a stranger. "You need to do something," she hissed one night, her arms crossed as she stood in the doorway of their bedroom. Daniel sat on the edge of the bed, rubbing his temples. "What do you expect me to do?" Sophia scoffed. "You're his father. He needs to understand that this is his life now. You let Emma walk away and now he's acting like a broken toy." Daniel tensed. Let Emma walk away. Something about those words made his stomach twist in a way he didn't like. Sophia sighed dramatically. "He'll adjust. He just needs to stop clinging to the past." "The past. Emma." Daniel exhaled sharply, not wanting to continue the conversation. "I'll handle it." But the truth was he didn't know how. A few days later he walked into Noah's room, expecting to find him playing like he used to. Instead, the boy sat in the corner, his tiny hands clutching a piece of paper. His blonde curls were messier than usual, his clothes wrinkled as if he hadn't bothered to change all day. Daniel frowned. "Noah, what are you doing?" Noah didn't answer. Daniel stepped closer, and that's when he saw it. A drawing. A crayon sketch of their house, drawn with shaky lines. But in front of it stood 3 figures. One tall man, one small boy, and a woman with long golden hair. "Emma." Daniel's chest tightened. He crouched beside his son, speaking carefully. "Noah, why don't you draw Sophia too?" Noah stiffened. For a long moment he didn't move. Then finally his small hands crumpled the paper into a tight ball. Daniel's brows furrowed. "Noah." "I don't want to," the boy whispered. His little voice was quiet, but there was an edge to it. A finality. Daniel stared at him, something foreign pressing against his ribs. Noah hadn't just accepted that Emma was gone. He was holding on to her. That night, Daniel expected him to sleep like normal. But when he passed by Noah's room, he heard something that made him stop in his tracks. Soft, muffled sobs. He pressed his palm against the doorframe, his throat suddenly dry. Noah was crying for Emma. Daniel swallowed hard, stepping back into the shadows of the hallway. Noah had never cried for him. The realization sank deep into his bones, cold and unforgiving. This wasn't working. This perfect new life he had built. It was falling apart. Daniel sat in his office, staring blankly at the city skyline beyond the window. The whiskey in his glass remained untouched, the amber liquid catching the dim light. He had always enjoyed this view, this feeling of control, of power. But tonight it felt hollow. Noah's cries still echoed in his mind. He had told himself that Noah would adjust, that with time his son would accept Sophia, would accept this life. But he hadn't. And Daniel was beginning to realize he never would. His phone buzzed. Sophia's name lit up the screen. He ignored it. Instead, he scrolled through his contacts until he found Emma's name. His thumb hovered over the call button. He hadn't spoken to her since that night. The night she walked away. The night he let her go. He clenched his jaw, lowering the phone before he could make the mistake of calling. What would he even say? Would she even answer? He exhaled sharply, standing from his chair. Downstairs, the house was too quiet. He found Noah sitting on the floor of the living room, clutching a small stuffed bear. The lights from the fireplace cast shadows across his tiny frame, making him look even smaller than he already was. Daniel approached carefully, hands in his pockets. "Noah, it's late. You should be in bed." No response. He sighed, sitting down on the couch. "I know this has been a change. But I promise things will get better." Noah's little hands tightened around the bear. "Mommy would sing to me," he whispered. Daniel stiffened. Noah finally lifted his gaze, those green eyes, Emma's eyes, shining with unshed tears. "She used to sing to me when I couldn't sleep." Daniel swallowed, his throat dry. He remembered. How many nights had he walked past Noah's room, hearing Emma's soft voice lull their son to sleep? How many times had he taken that for granted? "She's not here, buddy," he said, his voice lower now. "But you can still." "I don't want her," Noah interrupted. Daniel froze. The way he had said it, with so much quiet anger, with so much certainty, Daniel didn't need to ask who he meant. Sylvia. Noah refused to accept her. Daniel had done everything to make this transition easy, to erase Emma from their lives, to prove that he had made the right choice. But looking at his son now, he wondered, had he made a mistake? For the first time the thought took root, spreading through his mind like a sickness. He had told himself that Emma was just an inconvenience, that she was just his wife by law, not by love. But what if he had been wrong? What if, in choosing Sophia and forcing Emma out, he had destroyed the only family that had ever truly belonged to him? Noah turned away, curling up on the floor. Daniel sat there, staring at his son, the weight of regret pressing down on his chest like an unbearable force. And for the first time since Emma left, he felt afraid. Afraid that what was broken could never be fixed. Daniel sat at the kitchen table, staring at his untouched coffee. The house was silent, yet the silence felt different now. It wasn't peaceful. It was suffocating. Sophia had left early that morning, mumbling something about a spa appointment, completely unfazed by Noah's breakdown the night before. Daniel barely noticed. His mind was elsewhere. Noah's words from the previous night wouldn't leave him. I don't want her. The rejection had been sharp, final. His son had chosen Emma. No matter how much Daniel had tried to replace her, erase her, Noah had never let go. And neither had he. Without thinking, he pulled out his phone. His fingers hovered over Emma's number again, but he hesitated. He knew she wouldn't answer. Not after everything. So instead he did something he never thought he'd do. He hired a private investigator. It wasn't difficult. Money could buy anything, and Daniel had more than enough. Within hours he had a report in front of him, one that made his stomach twist. Emma hadn't just left. She had rebuilt herself. She had moved to a new city, found a job, created a life where he no longer existed. The images attached to the file made something clench in his chest. Emma walking through the streets, her blonde hair catching in the sunlight. Her green eyes were different now, brighter, lighter. And worst of all, he was smiling. A real smile. One he hadn't seen in years. Daniel clenched his jaw, tossing the file onto the table. She was happier without him. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. He had told himself that she had walked away in anger, that she had left because she was weak, because she couldn't handle losing Noah. But that wasn't the truth. She had left because he had given her no reason to stay. And he hated himself for it. He exhaled sharply, gripping the edge of the table. He had to see her. Not just for Noah, but for himself. Because for the first time in his life, Daniel Carter was forced to face the one thing he had spent years avoiding. The truth. He had ruined everything. No. He wasn't sure if he could ever fix it. I never expected to see him again. Not like this. The cafe was quiet that afternoon, the soft hum of conversation blending with the sound of clinking coffee cups. I sat near the window, flipping through a book, letting the sunlight warm my skin. It was the first time in years that I felt at peace. Then I heard it. Mommy. The book slipped from my hands. I froze, my breath caught in my throat, my heart hammering against my ribs. I knew that voice. I had dreamed of that voice. Fully I turned. Noah stood in the doorway, his green eyes wide, his little chest rising and falling rapidly. His blonde curls were messier than I remembered, his tiny hands clenched into fists at his sides, like he was afraid I would disappear. Tears burned at the back of my eyes. I couldn't speak. I couldn't move. And then he ran. He threw himself into my arms, his small body colliding against mine with enough force to knock the air from my lungs. I clutched him tightly, my hands shaking as I buried my face in his hair. He smelled the same, like sunshine and the faintest hint of vanilla, like home. Mommy, he sobbed, his tiny arms wrapping around my neck. I missed you so much. I squeezed my eyes shut, fighting to breathe past the ache in my chest. I missed you too, baby, I whispered, pressing a kiss against his soft curls. I missed you so much. The world around us faded. Nothing existed outside of this moment. My son in my arms again where he belonged. Then I heard another voice. A voice that made my blood turn to ice. Emma. I lifted my head, my arms still wrapped protectively around Noah. Daniel stood just a few feet away, his blue eyes locked on me. He looked different. His suit was slightly disheveled, his jaw tense, his usual arrogance dimmed. He looked haunted. I hated that part of me still noticed. I rose slowly, keeping Noah close, my fingers gently combing through his curls as I forced my expression to remain calm. "What are you doing here?" I asked, my voice steady despite the storm inside me. Daniel didn't answer right away. His gaze flickered to Noah, who clung to me like he was afraid I would be ripped away again. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken words. Then finally Daniel exhaled. "I needed to see you." I swallowed hard, biting back the bitterness rising in my throat. "Now you have." Daniel flinched slightly, as if he hadn't expected the sharpness in my voice. As if he hadn't spent months tearing me apart. Noah lifted his head from my shoulder, sniffling softly. "Can I go home with you, Mommy?" My heart cracked wide open. I tightened my grip on him, my jaw clenched. "Of course you can, baby." Daniel tensed. "Noah," he said carefully, his tone softer than I had ever heard before. "We need to talk about this." Noah shook his head violently. "No," he whispered. "I don't want to go with you." Daniel's face paled. For the first time I saw it. The regret, the weight of his mistakes pressing down on him. He had spent months trying to erase me. But in doing so he had lost his son. And now he was finally paying the price. Daniel's silence was suffocating. I held Noah close, my arms wrapped around his small frame as if I could shield him from everything. From the past, from the pain, from Daniel. But Daniel wasn't looking at me anymore. His blue eyes were locked on our son, wide and shaken. Noah had always been his shadow, following him around the house, clinging to him whenever he came home from work. Daniel had been his hero, his protector. Now, he looked at his father like a stranger. I saw the exact moment it hit Daniel. He took a slow step forward, his voice carefully measured. "No, buddy, I know you're upset." Noah buried his face in my neck. "I don't want to go with you." Daniel's jaw tightened. I could see the muscles ticking, his fists clenching at his sides. He was losing control of something he never imagined he could lose. And it terrified him. I exhaled slowly, keeping my voice firm. "You don't get to force him, Daniel." His gaze snapped to mine. "He's my son." I held my ground. "And look at him." He did. Noah trembled in my arms, his little hands clutching my sweater, his shoulders shaking with quiet, exhausted sobs. He wasn't throwing a tantrum. He wasn't being stubborn. He was afraid. Daniel's entire body tensed. "I never wanted this," he muttered almost to himself. His fingers raked through his dark hair, his mask of composure slipping. "This wasn't." He stopped, exhaling harshly. "I thought she'd be good for him." I laughed softly, shaking my head. It wasn't funny. None of this was funny. But the sheer audacity of that statement made my stomach turn. "Good for him." My voice came out sharp, cold. "You tore his world apart. You told him to call another woman his mother. You treated me like I was nothing and you expected him to be okay?" Daniel's eyes darkened. "I made a mistake." I let out a bitter breath, shifting Noah's weight in my arms. "Yeah. You did." His throat bobbed as he swallowed, his fingers tightening into fists. "I'll fix it." Noah finally lifted his head, his tear-streaked face pressing against my shoulder as he looked at his father. "I don't want you to." Daniel flinched like he'd been punched. His chest rose and fell in slow, uneven breaths. His carefully curated world was crumbling around him, and for the first time he had no way to stop it. "Emma," he said quietly. "Please." I had waited so long to hear that word from him. But now, standing here with my son clinging to me, with the weight of everything he had done pressing against my ribs, I felt nothing. He had burned me to the ground. And now he was begging me to let him stand in the ashes. I shook my head. "No." His lips parted slightly like he hadn't expected that. I took a slow breath, my hand soothing over Noah's back as I stepped toward the door. "I'm taking him home." Daniel inhaled sharply like he wanted to argue. But what could he say? He had lost. Not just me. Not just our marriage. He had lost Noah. And for the first time in his life there was no way to fix it. I turned my back on him, walking away for the second time. But this time I wasn't leaving alone. Noah was coming with me. And Daniel would have to live with that for the rest of his life. Noah fell asleep in the car before we even made it out of the city. His small body was curled up in the passenger seat, his face relaxed for the first time in what felt like forever. I reached over, brushing a strand of blonde hair from his forehead, my chest tightening at the sight of him. "My baby. My heart." I had him back. But I knew this wasn't over. Daniel wouldn't let this go. He had spent months controlling every part of my life, shaping the narrative to fit his own version of events. He wouldn't just walk away. He wasn't built that way. And yet something about tonight felt different. When he had looked at Noah, really looked at him, he had seen what I had seen for months. The sadness, the pain, the way our son had wilted under his care. He had realized it too late. But he had realized it. I pulled into the parking lot of my apartment complex, turning off the engine. The night air was crisp as I carried Noah inside, his little arms wrapping around my neck in his sleep. Home. For the first time in months I felt like I could breathe. I tucked him into bed, pressing a soft kiss to his forehead before stepping back, watching his slow, steady breaths. He was safe. A knock at the door made me stiffen. I knew who it was before I even turned the knob. Daniel stood on the other side, his shoulders tense, his blue eyes dark with something unreadable. He looked different, exhausted, drained. I crossed my arms over my chest, leaning against the door frame. You shouldn't be here. He let out a slow breath. I know. Silence stretched between us. For years, it had been the thing that broke us. The words left unsaid, the things we ignored. But this silence was different. It wasn't empty. It was full of everything. I was wrong, he said finally, his voice quieter than I had ever heard it. About everything. I swallowed hard. I had spent so long waiting for those words. I had imagined hearing them over and over, but now that they were here they meant nothing. I shook my head. That doesn't change what you did. I know. His jaw tightened. But I can't lose him, Emma. A part of me wanted to say you already have. But I couldn't. Not when I saw the way his hands curled into fists, like he was trying to hold himself together. Not when I saw the pain in his eyes, the kind that wasn't for me but for Noah. I let out a slow breath. He's asleep. Daniel nodded, glancing past me toward the small apartment. His gaze softened slightly. Does he seem happy? I exhaled. Happier than he's been in months. He pressed his lips together, looking away. I had never seen Daniel Carter at a loss for words. But tonight he looked lost. I don't know how to fix this, he admitted. My chest ached, but I refused to let it show. You can't. His eyes snapped back to mine. Emma. You can't undo this, Daniel, I said softly, finally letting myself say the truth. You made your choices. You put another woman in my place. You told our son to forget me. I forced myself to hold his gaze. Now you have to live with that. His face cracked. Just for a second. Just long enough for me to see the remorse, the guilt. I stepped back, gripping the door handle. Go home. He hesitated like he wanted to say more. Maybe he did. But instead he exhaled slowly and gave a small, defeated nod. For the first time he listened. I closed the door. And this time I was the one who walked away. The days passed, and for the first time in a long time I felt at peace. Noah settled into our new life quickly. The weight he had carried for months began to lift, his laughter returning in soft, hesitant bursts until one day, it was unrestrained. I had almost forgotten what it felt like to hear my son truly happy. We built routines. Early mornings with pancakes, late nights with bedtime stories. We spent afternoons at the park, his tiny hand gripping mine as he pointed at the swings, his green eyes lighting up. This was what we had lost. And now it was ours again. Daniel didn't call. At first I expected him to show up at my door to demand another fight, to try and twist things back into his favor. But he didn't. Instead, silence stretched between us. It wasn't the silence we had once lived in. The kind filled with resentment, with unspoken words and growing distance. This was acceptance. And I wasn't sure if it made me feel relieved or hollow. One evening I found Noah sitting on the floor of his room, crayons scattered around him. He had drawn something that made my chest tighten. A small house. 2 figures standing in front of it. A woman with golden hair holding hands with a little boy. Just us. No Daniel. No mansion. No reminders of the life we had left behind. I sat beside him, smoothing a hand over his curls. That's a beautiful drawing, sweetheart. He looked up at me, his green eyes filled with something soft, something secure. We're happy now, he said simply. Tears burned at the back of my eyes, but I smiled. Because he was right. That night I sat on the couch with a cup of tea, staring out the window at the city lights. My phone vibrated on the coffee table, the name flashing across the screen. Daniel. I hesitated, then picked up. His voice was quieter than usual. How is he? I took a slow breath, glancing toward Noah's room where soft breathing filled the quiet apartment. He's okay. Daniel was silent for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was rough. Does he ask about me? I closed my eyes. Not as much as before. Another pause. A deep inhale. That's fair. I didn't know what else to say. There was a time when I would have given anything to hear regret in his voice, to know he was suffering as much as I had. But now, sitting here in the life I had rebuilt, I didn't need it anymore. We had both lost something. But I had found something too. Myself. Daniel let out a slow exhale. I don't expect you to believe me, Emma, but I really am sorry. I swallowed hard, staring down at my hands. There was a part of me, the old me, that wanted to say I forgive you. That wanted to soften, to give him some kind of comfort. But the woman I was now knew some things couldn't be undone. I hope you mean that, I said finally. And then for the last time, I hung up. The world kept moving and so did we. Noah and I built a life that was ours. One that wasn't defined by loss or betrayal, but by new beginnings. Mornings were filled with laughter, evenings with bedtime stories, and in between we found something we hadn't had in so long: peace. I never heard from Daniel again after that last phone call. And I never reached out. There was a time when his absence would have left me feeling hollow, but now it was just a quiet fact of my life. He had been a part of my story, but he wasn't the ending. One day, months later, I found myself sitting on a park bench watching Noah race across the playground. His blonde curls bounced with every step, his laughter bright, carefree. A man sat down beside me. I didn't have to look to know who it was. Daniel's presence wasn't as sharp as it once had been. He didn't hold himself like a man in control anymore. He looked tired. Older. He didn't speak right away. Neither did I. Dad, we both watched Noah. Finally he sighed. He looks happy. He is. Daniel nodded slowly, his blue eyes never leaving our son. His fingers curled slightly on his lap, his lips pressing into a thin line before he spoke again. I won't fight you on this. I exhaled, my chest feeling lighter than it had in years. You already did, I said softly. And you lost. His jaw tightened, but there was no anger in his eyes. Just acceptance. I know. For the first time, Daniel Carter had nothing left to say. No manipulation. No arrogance. Just a man sitting beside me, watching the child he had once tried to keep, knowing he had already lost him. I stood, brushing the wrinkles from my dress, tilting my head toward Noah. He still loves you, you know. He just needed me more. Daniel nodded, his throat bobbing as he swallowed.